Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Haley Paul, and I'm an Outreach and Communications Associate with Mid-Atlantic TAB. Welcome to today's webinar, the Fiscal Year 2026 EPA Brownfields Grant Guidelines Overview for Pennsylvania, where you'll get to hear from the experts and ask them all of your EPA Brownfield grant-related questions. A few quick notes. There will be time allotted for Q&A, so please make note of any questions that come up during the presentation, or feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout. Additionally, a recording of this presentation and the slides will be made available. As I said, I'm Haley, and here soon you'll be hearing from Jared, who is also with Mid-Atlantic TAB and based at West Virginia University. A little bit about Mid-Atlantic TAB. We are the technical assistance provider for EPA Region 3, which includes Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. We'll talk more about the resources and services we offer later in the presentation. One of the resources we offer is Brownfield Education, an example of which is today's webinar. Also contributing to this presentation are Christian with EPA Region 3 and John Gross with Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. If you missed our first webinar in this series, you can check out the slides and recording for more details about each Brownfield grant application, including threshold, narrative, and meeting requirements, as well as eligible activities. Finally, here's an overview of what's to come. You'll hear about an overview of EPA Brownfield grants and eligibility, SAM.gov and application threshold criteria, FY26 MAC grant changes, information on grant packages, as well as key information and TAB resources with time for questions at the end. With that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Jared.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jared Stewart. I'm with Mid-Atlantic TAB. First off, EPA grant overview. This year, they're offering multi-purpose grants, assessment grants, and cleanup grants. The timeline this year, applications are due January 28th. Threshold eligibility review will take place in February and March. The national review will take place in March and April. And in May, the EPA Office of Brownfields will do their selection review. And then announcements they take place in June. So some eligibility for all grants. State, local, and tribal governments are eligible. General purpose units of local government, regional council or redevelopment agencies, nonprofit organizations, and quasi-governmental agencies. So anticipated funding for this year, this is one of the larger grant awards they've offered. There'll be 70 community-wide assessment awards, 20 multi-purpose, 39 for assessment coalitions, 18 for community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, and then 36 altogether cleanup grants. Those are with maximum amounts of $500,000 or $4 million. Okay, so going over eligibility for multiple grant applications. This chart kind of goes over those depending on which grant app type you're applying for on the left column there, and then what you can apply for on the top. So pretty much you can, if you're applying for one grant, you usually can't apply for another unless you're trying to do cleanup and assessment grants, or cleanup, unless you're doing a cleanup and one of the assessment grant types. So this chart is eligibility for existing grant recipients. So if your organization currently has one of the grant types in the column on the left, then you can apply for any of the grant types on the top column. So thing I want to highlight here is that for most of these, can have multiple grants at the same time. There's a drawdown requirement, which is usually about 70% of your existing grant. And then if you have a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, you cannot have another assessment grant at the same time. Now I'll be going over SAM.gov. SAM.gov, SAM stands for System for Award Management. It's an official website of the U.S. government. It's free to use. This is how you register to do business with the U.S. government. You can update or renew your entity registration, check the status of that registration, search for registration and exclusion records. And registering for SAM.gov can take about 2 weeks, so you want to get on that as soon as possible. Notice of funding opportunities will be released through grants.gov. And then in order to apply for those funding opportunities, you'll need to have an active SAM.gov registration. Applicants should ensure that they have an active unique identity ID, and you should have that now. The EPA may not be flexible in allowing applicants to submit applications outside of grants.gov. So again, to register, check your status, or renew your registration with SAM.gov, you'll need that unique entity ID, your tax ID number, and then a bank routing number, bank account number, and account type. And that'll be to set up the electronic funds transfer. Your registration must be renewed every 12 months. It must be active when you're applying for grants. Your contact information must be correct and up to date. And using SAM.gov is free, so if you come across anything that's requiring payment, we just want to watch out for scams there.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to throw out a procurement warning for everyone. A qualified environmental professional cannot prepare grant applications and be awarded the contract to implement the grant. That's the multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan fund, or the cleanup grants without going through a competitive bid process. And this is just so that they don't have insider information. Everyone should be competing on the same level playing field. So typically there's contractors that will specifically write grants and they stay away from the QEP side of actually the involvement in the grant. That's the safest way to do it, but just a warning for everyone, watch out for this. So next we'll talk about some of the threshold criteria. So for all the grants, there's the threshold criteria that you're going to have to meet to be able to apply for the grant. Otherwise, you're going to be thrown out the door in our initial threshold review. This is a simple pass-fail. It's either you are or you aren't. So this information has to be submitted through grants.gov. Make sure you read over the NOFO, detail exactly what you need. Make sure you're looking at your right NOFO. There are 4 different, or I believe 3 different NOFOs. One for each different grant type. There's an assessment grant NOFO, a cleanup grant NOFO, and a multi-purpose grant NOFO. Make sure you look at your specific one that you're intending to apply for and make sure you go through that and make sure you tick all the boxes for the threshold criteria. I recommend you don't skip anything. If something's not applicable to you, explain why it's not applicable. Don't simply leave a blank space there. Always double check your work. You cannot make changes to your application past the submission deadline. If you submit prior to January 28th, you can resubmit. We'll use your last submission as your final submission. But past January 28th, we cannot make any changes for whatever reason. If your computer crashes, we can't accept anything. We can't accept anything through email. So I'd highly recommend that you submit this a couple days ahead of time if you're feeling that you've got everything prepared and you're feeling confident. Responses to each criterion are required and must be included as an attachment in the grant narrative. Like I said, please don't skip anything. A lot of times, some people will say this doesn't apply to me, I'm just going to omit it. We have to look at only what's in the application. We can't really use outside sources to evaluate you. We can't use past knowledge. So if something's not there, we have to assume that you forgot it. So please don't skip anything. Please explain why it's not applicable or why you don't think that you should need to answer this section. Applications that are deemed ineligible for funding consideration will fail the threshold eligibility review, and there is a requirement that we notify you within 15 calendar days of the ineligibility determination. At that point, you can request a debrief, and we can discuss where you were, where you lost points in your, or not points, but where you failed the threshold review. So a little more in detail, going down to these specific grant types for assessment and multi-purpose grants. You're going to need a current letter from your environmental state agency. That would be DEP in this case if you're a Pennsylvania grant applicant. And you would have to submit a request letter to them. You cannot use letters from previous years. It has to be one dated from this year. So please, a lot of times we have, applicants that will fail 1 year and they think that they can just, resubmit the same application and same attachments. That's simply not the case. You can resubmit the same application. We don't necessarily recommend it. If it failed once, there's probably something that you could do to bolster it. So just keep that in mind. For cleanup grants, again, you're going to need a letter from the environmental state agency acknowledging that the applicant plans to conduct a cleanup activity a cleanup at a brownfield site. The application must affirm that the site has been characterized. The state letter must make a determination saying that there is a sufficient level of characterization at the site or that additional assessment is needed. And if additional assessment is needed, please state this in your application that you will have sufficient characterization by June 15th. That's going to be a hard deadline. If you don't have sufficient characterization by then, there's a chance that your award will fall through if selected. So please, if you think you need additional assessment for characterization purposes, please state that you have a plan in place and that you're going to have this completed. We don't want to award a cleanup grant and then 2 years down the road, we're still trying to figure out what it is actually at the site, the extent of the contamination, and how we're going to remediate it. We want people applying for a cleanup grant to know what it is that they intend to clean up the contamination at the site and have a strong plan in place. And then for cleanup grants, you're also going to need to have a phase 2 environmental site assessment completed or equivalent. And this is essentially where you're going to get your site characterization from. So another big eligibility requirement for cleanup grants specifically is that you must be the sole owner of the site by the application submission deadline. So that's free and simple title through a legal document. And you must have conducted an all appropriate inquiry prior to purchasing the property. That's typically included in a phase 1 environmental assessment. And this must be conducted within 180 days of the property transfer. If you conducted this 181 days ago and then bought the property, technically this would be outside the window. So what this does, this all appropriate inquiry, it gives you liability protection. We look at the site before you purchase it, say, hey, there's contamination here. You're buying the site knowing that there's contamination, and you're going to do your best to prevent the spread of that. And this gives you liability protection to apply for a cleanup grant. So please always make sure you get your phase 1 conducted before or the all appropriate inquiry specifically, which is included in the phase 1 before purchasing a property. So for cleanup grants, you're going to have to post a community notification of your application. And you're going to need to do this at least 14 days prior to submitting. And the reason for this is we want you to put your application out there. We want you to give the community a chance to respond. to give their input on, this site that you're intending to remediate. We want to make sure that this is in the public's best interest. It's something that they're looking for. You're not just putting in some random, business or convenience that's going to suit you best. We want to meet the needs of the community. We want to help them out. So you're going to be required to post in some sort of public fashion, either social media. A lot of times it's through newspapers, radio, whatever it is that your community uses that'll get the word out there. You're required to post that you're intending to apply for an application, hold a meeting, allow the public to comment on it. You should take a sign-in sheet, have a place for comments, and you should also talk about how these comments are going to be incorporated into the application in a meaningful way. So the deadline this year is January 28th. That means 14 days prior, you should have the notification no later than January 14th. If it's posted on the 15th, that's going to render you ineligible to receive a cleanup grant. Again, this is part of the threshold criteria, so there really is no leeway. If you post it on January 15th, that's an immediate fail right there. There's nothing we can do. So again, this is more of what I was saying. You can post an ad in a local newspaper. Equivalent means there's really a lot of different ways you can do this. Whatever your community uses, if they post flyers on a weekly bulletin board, a town hall meeting or something like that, as long as you make your good faith effort to get the word out there to, maximize the turnout here. Again, we clearly just want the community to be involved. Another requirement of your cleanup application is something called an APCA, ABCA. It stands for Alternatives to Brownfields Cleanup Analysis. And this just, takes a look at a couple different options. What happens if you leave the site alone? What happens if you remediate the site? What happens if you cap the site? So it's essentially just making sure that you're not tunnel visioning and that you're actually going to proceed with the best solution for the site. And again, we want the public to be able to comment on this in the draft meeting. So you should have a draft APCA available for the meeting. It doesn't have to be in its final state at this point, because again, you should be collecting comments at these meetings and then incorporating them into the APCA if it's appropriate. So we have a full handout on all of our property ownership eligibility for hazardous petroleum and CERCLA liability protection on our website. We encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of different avenues you can take here to be CERCLA exempt from CERCLA liability. And what this means is, because you have to be the owner of the site, it means we're not going to personally hold you liable for the contamination at the site. Like I said, if you do that, all appropriate inquiries, you knew that the contamination was there, but you're still buying the site because you want to transform it. You want to, make it into something positive. So we're not going to hold that against you. You're making good faith efforts here. So there's a lot of different options you can take here. We highly encourage you to check this out on our website. And then similar for our assessment grant, we have full handouts online, frequently asked questions, as well as another great place to check out, eligibility questions. It'll talk about community involvement, your contractors, named subrecipients, expenditures of existing grant funds. It'll walk you through how you have to have like a 70% drawdown if you already have an existing assessment grant. If you've named subcontractor and subrecipients, there's some unique requirements that you should include in your application. And again, it'll talk to you about the community involvement that you have to have. We don't want people just going rogue and like, hey, I've decided that this town needs, a spa location in here and it's going to boost morale and everything's going to be great. Well, the whole town could be against that because they want medical officers or something like that. So that's kind of the intent of this. So now for the changes this year in the MAC competition, I'm actually going to pass that off to Dawn Fogger, who is one of my coworkers here, to talk about the changes this year.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian. Appreciate it. So yes, I'm going to talk about some of the changes that we're seeing in the Notice of Funding Opportunities and Guidelines from fiscal year 25. The main thing you need to remember is that once you get a copy of these slides, this link here has a complete list of all of the changes to the grant guidelines. So if you've applied in the past, have already drafted applications, even have received a grant previously, this will show you what some of those changes are that have taken place between fiscal year 25 or fiscal year 24 for the last time we had multi-purpose grants. This link is also on the bottom of each of the slides we're going to go through. So make sure that if you have questions after this, you check that link, and that will give you the full list of all of the changes to the grant guidelines. First, we're going to talk about the changes for all grants. So one of the changes is that we have a new streamlined notice of funding opportunities and guidance. And so the main thing to note, again, if you've applied previously, is that some of the information has been rearranged into different sections. It's also a little bit more simplified, which we appreciate. If you look at the guidelines, it can give you details, but we ask everyone every time, read the new guidelines, read the new notice of funding opportunities, make sure that you're providing the information requested in the locations it's requested. Similar to what Christian spoke about previously with the threshold, we want you to answer every single question that is asked in that notice of funding opportunities and in the guidelines and in the sections where it's requested. If there's something that doesn't apply to your organization, please make note that it doesn't apply, but that you've considered that question or that request for information. As an example, if you're a very small community, maybe you don't have detailed information about your immediate community, but you do have some information for a larger community around you. If that's the case, just make sure that you say that and not, we don't want it to look like you just skipped a question and didn't answer it. That'll allow us to give you as many points as possible. In addition, we have some updated language requirements that will align with the current administration's initiatives. So make sure that you review that for some language changes that are being asked for in that notice of funding opportunities. And also there's some clarification for grants on how nonprofit organizations that are 501c4 organizations may be eligible to apply for a grant. Throughout the notice of funding opportunities and guidelines, there are multiple tables that you can use to fill out. Specifically, a good one to use is the sample format for the budget table. If you use those, then we see a little more consistency in what comes in from our applications, as well as it makes it easier for you to make sure you're not missing anything that's requested. And I will talk specifically about assessment grants. As Christian mentioned, and also Jared mentioned as he was going through his slides, if you currently have a grant, you should check those eligibility charts to see if you're eligible to apply for another grant if you're interested. There are some rules related to drawdowns, which again also Jared and Christian mentioned. In the case of a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, also known as a CWAG street grant, you must meet the 60% drawdown requirement for each of those CWAG street grants that you have to apply for another CWAG street grant. All of these drawdowns had to be completed, the target drawdown percentages had to be completed by October 1st, 2025. So if you have a current assessment grant or a multi-purpose grant and you're interested in applying for a community-wide assessment grant, you must have met a 70% drawdown requirement by October 1st, 2025. Again, all of that is in those eligibility charts. So if you have questions on any of these, you can go back to those charts and it will give you that information in a pretty straightforward way. We've also provided some breakdowns of what the maximum number of points is that can be earned for your application in each of these types of grants, as well as a breakdown of the percentages for each section, percentage of points that goes towards each section. That's all available in the guidelines and the notice of funding opportunities. It can help you maybe see what you might want to focus on a little bit more, but again, we're requesting that everyone answer all the questions and that can help maximize the number of points that you receive. Next slide, please. For assessment coalition grants, this goes back to also a chart that Jared shared with our approximate funding amounts for different grant types and how many will be awarded. For the assessment coalition grants, the awards are available up to $1.5 million. If you have an open award already or a pending award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, unfortunately, you're not eligible to apply for an assessment grant under this solicitation. There are some changes related to limitations on who's eligible to be a lead assessment coalition grant recipient, as well as the non-lead members. This has been changed so that the eligibility is the same for both groups. So whether you're a lead member or a non-lead member, the same eligibility requirements need to be met. If you have an assessment and or multi-purpose grant and you want to apply for an assessment coalition grant, you have to have met that 70% drawdown requirement by October 1st, 2025. And then with regard to coalition target areas, first of all, the target areas may not overlap, and the target areas must be in at least 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. So you may have a lead member and then 3 different or non-lead members that represent these 3 target areas that are distinct from or the 3 distinct target areas. Those can be towns, cities, tribes. So we're a little flexible in what those can be, but you just need to make sure that you have 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. Again, we're showing you the percentage point distribution. You will note that the maximum number of points available may change depending on the type of grant you're applying for as well. Next slide, please. Next, we'll talk about multi-purpose grants and the changes we've seen. So the last time multi-purpose grants were granted was in fiscal year 2024. We do those every other year, similar to the RLF grants that we do generally every other year. If you have an open award or pending award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, you are not eligible to apply for a multi-purpose grant. But if you have an assessment or multi-purpose grant currently and you want to apply for funding, you just have to meet that 70% drawdown. Again, we have the point percentage distribution for the different sections of the application, and the maximum number of points you can earn for this application review is 165. Next slide. And finally, we'll talk about cleanup grants. Okay, so you've already heard this a little bit from Christian. You're going to hear this again, most likely, as PADEP talks about their state letters. But for your site characterization, very specifically, if you need additional assessment to sufficiently characterize the site for remediation work to begin, the statement in the state letter must confirm that. So it's either going to confirm that you have enough assessment and you have enough data collected, you have a sufficient amount of site characterization that you're ready to move forward with remediation. Or the state letter will say that you need some additional assessment to be ready to do remediation. So that will be in the letter, and then as the applicant, you also need to have a statement affirming that you have a sufficient level of site characterization, or you will have a sufficient level of site characterization by June 15th, 2026. So that means you'll have collected additional data, whatever you need to design that remediation so you can start work on remediation. You'll hear, like I said, you'll hear it again in the state letter, but that's the main highlight related to the site characterization for cleanup grants this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so another thing that state letter will include in here is whether or not your site is planning to be enrolled into their state voluntary response program. So again, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection will speak about this a little bit later, but that's one of the things that will be included in their letter for you. Please note that your budget can be used to pay for costs related to enrolling in that state voluntary response program. So that's something to keep in mind as you develop your budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, who's eligible to apply for these if you already have a grant? So if you have a multi-purpose grant already, you are eligible to apply if you have drawn down 70% of your grant by October 1st, 2025. And then once again, we have this breakdown for you just to kind of keep in mind which sections you may want to focus a little bit more on. But as I said, answer all the questions to the best of your ability, or if it doesn't apply, tell us why it doesn't apply. In this case, for the cleanup grants, we have a couple of extra things we're asking for, and your maximum number of points for those grants is 175 for your application reviews. Okay, next slide. All right, we're going to take a quick breath here, and if anyone has any questions, you can either type them in the chat and we'll respond there as we've been doing so far, or you can take yourself off mute and ask a question. We will also stay after the end of the presentation if anyone has other questions that come up during the presentation. So I'll stop for just a second and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, otherwise I'm going to hand this off to PADEP to take the next section. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. John Gross from Pennsylvania DEP Brownfields Redevelopment Manager here. My section is going to be pretty quick here. Just talking about the grant package, what's necessary, what you need in there. Generally, got three separate sections: your narrative proposal, which is what EPA is going to be judging on; your threshold criteria, the general, like are you eligible, and then the forms and attachments. Make sure you have all the extra forms and the budget attachments and all that kind of stuff. So we'll go through each of that. First thing you're going to have is your application information sheet, which I think was narration, or I would say narrative information sheet there at the bottom. Basically, your information, the information of the applicant on the applicant's letterhead, name, full address, website URL, all the stuff that's listed here. Very important things like what grant you're applying for, what and how much you're applying for. Those are very important notes to put it within this information sheet. Your target areas, the locations, the priority sites, and that's all going to be dependent on whether you're doing site-specific information for an assessment or a cleanup or a multi-purpose grant. As Don was talking about, the coalition grants that you're different threshold areas of different municipalities, that's all going to be in there. Population jurisdictions, your targeted area, general information about your population and folks that are in that area. There's a checklist of all this stuff that you're going to have. Each of the individual grants has a specific checklist that you can go through and make sure you have all the stuff that you're supposed to have as part of the grant package. And then as Don was saying earlier, and I think even Christian mentioned it, your letter of support. Letter of support is going to be the key from the state, and that's kind of more what we're going to be talking about here in general. Go ahead, next slide on that. The idea in the narrative ranking, and we'll talk about like the general idea of what we think EPA is looking for in the most sense of these narratives is they want a good story succinctly put in a very specific amount of single-spaced narrative that is 10 pages or less for a cleanup or assessment grant, or 12 pages or less for a multi-purpose grant. They stop reviewing at the end of that 10 pages or 12 pages. So anything you put after that, really not gonna be reviewed at all. Generally speaking, the narrative is going to be your story of what you're doing, your project description, any plan for revitalization, any piece that kind of tells the story of what you're going to be doing, how it impacts the community, what community engagement are you going to have, what other groups are you going to be involving with this redevelopment, whether it's assessment or cleanup or wherever you're going. The descriptions, the costs, the estimates, the budget sheets, that kind of stuff are all going to be part of this. The idea of what you're doing, how you're going to go about doing it, and the cost for each of those pieces, and then how are you going to measure that progress? What are the criteria of where I'm going to be at a certain point at this point, and moving on, and then finally, your capabilities from a past performance standpoint. Like, have you had a grant before? Here's how we handled it. Have you not had a grant before, but here's who we're bringing in to help us understand and figure out how to move forward. So basically the idea that everything that you got experience wise, how you're going to help with putting this grant into action. Obviously your threshold criteria responses. So the responses to all those threshold criteria are going to be in the narrative. Why you qualify and why everything should be good to go, and then your other factors and all the other considerations that go into all this, the other piece of this. They are going, and at the bottom note here, they're going to review only the information that is requested and required. So that they're not encouraging you to take other support letters and all this other stuff from everybody else involved. Members of Congress, they'll look at them, they'll see them, but they're not going to really review or do anything with them as opposed to the actual stuff that's supposed to be within this grant application. So go ahead with the next slide. Obviously, this is the part that's most crucial for the state involvement in this, and that's the letter of support, whatever you want to call it. So go ahead with the next one. Um, Basically what we're looking for in an, and we'll go through it. So the letter, it's basically required for every grant. Basically what we have to do is acknowledge that we are aware of and support the project. It's a very simple letter. You can use one letter for multiple applications. So if you're doing a cleanup and an assessment application, you can certainly use it for both. And as I think mentioned before, it has to be current. You can't use last year's letter. Now you can send us last year's letter for the same grant that you maybe didn't get last year, and we will revamp it and put it together so that we have all the information. That's an easy way to do it. You can certainly just include that either in an email to either James Young, and his email address and phone number are there, or myself. Again, my email address and contact information are there as well. General information that we're looking for, especially for the assessment grant. Initially, we'll talk about the cleanup grant here in a second. But basically, what are you looking for? What grant are you looking for? How much are you pursuing? What is the basic information of the grant? And when I say basic information, the criteria basically of where's the grant, what's the area of application? So in other words, like where are you gonna submit to put this money? What sites are you looking for? You don't have to get super specific, but if you're looking at 3 sites in certain town USA, that's what we're looking for. Like we're looking to target these 3 areas in this county, to do assessment work and do do brownfields inventory or whatever the plan is, but in like a 2 or 3 sentence kind of synopsis of what you're looking for. This one that a lot of people don't think about, but who should that letter be addressed to? That should be addressed to the applicant, not the person who's writing the grant, but the applicant, whoever is the entity that is applying for the grant. And if you have a name with that, that'd be great. And then obviously as soon as possible. But generally give us at least a good 2-week notice before you're expecting to submit your grant. So obviously that means 2 weeks prior to the January deadline is like the deadline for asking for these. Generally doesn't take that long. Most of the time, especially for an assessment grant, it's we have a couple people looking at it. We have our program manager, I think, is on the call today. We'll sign it, and then we'll get it back to you as quickly as possible. And generally, the person who's asking for that is whoever's writing the grant. They're kind of getting their criteria all together and make sure that they have everything put together. They request it from us. We send it back to them, and then they can put it in the package and make sure it's attached to everything. There's a link to the land recycling website there. Not that that's critical for what the discussion we're having, but it's a good website, so you should go look at it. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about cleanup and multi-purpose. So as Dawn kind of talked about it earlier, there is some more criteria that we need to kind of understand and know what's going on with the cleanup grants and the multi-purpose grants, which also includes the cleanup piece. Generally, the idea is that EPA wants to give money to people that are ready to do the cleanup. They don't want to give money to people that are still in the assessment process and trying to figure out if they need money for cleanup, or they think that they're going to need money for cleanup, but not sure yet. So generally speaking, we're going to ask you questions when you request a cleanup letter from us. Things like, are you already enrolled in the Act 2 program? If you are, that's great. And a lot of times because you're far enough into the Act 2 situation, we probably know where you're at in the process of assessment. And if you've got a cleanup plan already, you probably have done your assessment work, and this is probably going to be a little more simple than if you're not and you're thinking about it. So the state letter has to affirm that you're either eligible for entry into the Act 2 program or that you're already enrolled. So that's one criteria, basically, that you'll be ready for ready for cleanup, and you've done a sufficient level of assessment work and characterization to begin, in that early, I guess it's still spring, June 15th of 2026, but think beginning of summer. Make sure that you're ready for that, and we will make sure that is a situation where you're going to be eligible at that date. And that's basically the idea that you're going to have complete assessment and complete characterization of the site at that time. Generally, we're hoping that you have that assessment done now, because at that point, then cleanup funds that you need, and you've got some estimates of what you need there at that point. There's also situations where the sites aren't eligible for our Act 2 program. Things like asbestos and like lead paint removal and that kind of stuff. Generally, those are not, Act 2 is based on, soil and water contamination. So asbestos is in a building type contamination, which Act 2 does not cover. And if Act 2 is covering asbestos, you've probably got a bigger problem than you're thinking about. With that said, those sites are eligible for money too. We just have to verify that they're not eligible to get into our Act 2 program, which is also fine. But those letters will then say that. You can submit those requests to me or Jim Young on that previous slide. And that will be more of a kind of discussion that we have with you, as opposed to here's a couple of things that we need and some info that we need, and we can just put the letter together and send it out. This is going to be a little bit more back and forth of, where are you at? What are we doing? Are you in the program? Are you planning on being in the program or not? And why, and all that good stuff. So that's generally it about the cleanup stuff. I don't know if I have another slide or not. Go ahead and move to the next slide. I do not. So I'm not sure who I'm handing off to, but if there's any questions for me, please, feel free to do for that. But let's get through this key information first and take questions at the end.
Okay, so hold on one second. Is this me or is this Tab this meeting? Okay, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about these federal forms. So as part of your application, you're going to need to complete some federal forms that go along with that provide us some additional information, including the SF424, which is the application for federal assistance. Your budget information will go into your SF424A. There's a key contacts form that tells us about your organization and who we should be in touch with. Also a pre-award compliance review report, which is form 4700-4. And then your project narrative attachment form, your narrative information sheet and required attachments will be one file that goes along with your application. There is a link in this blue section where it says sample federal forms. So when you receive a copy of these slides, all these links will be live for you. And in that link, you can see some examples of how these forms need to be filled out, which can be super helpful. In addition, in that kind of magenta, pink, purple color at the bottom is a link to the EPA website that has all of our applicant and recipient forms. If you go to that website to download your forms, that will ensure that you have the most current version of all of those forms, which can be very important. We don't want you to fill out a form that maybe didn't have all the information that we required at some point or is out of order. The easier it can be for us to review your information, that's what you want to have happen. So make sure you get the most current version of all of those forms to use for your application. Okay, next slide, please. Also, if you had previously applied for a grant and went through a grant debrief process, make sure that you make changes based on what those recommendations were in that grant debrief. So if they gave you information on, say, you needed more detail in a certain section, make sure that you take those comments to heart and incorporate that, and that will increase your chances of getting an award the next time. If for some reason you apply this time and you're not successful, if you request a grant debrief, people will walk through with you where you could do some additional work or provide some additional information that will help you be successful in the next round. So we always recommend that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, when in doubt, check the frequently asked questions. This is an amazing document that's been put together based on questions we've received from previous applicants who have gone through the process for different types of grant applications. It's a pretty substantial document, but it's broken up into sections to make it more helpful. But that's a really good place to start if you have questions as you're working on your application. What are we looking for? What does this mean? What do we need to do in this case? Go to those frequently asked questions. Once you look through, If that helps you, fantastic. If it's not, that's a really good place to start if you reach out to a tab, for example, and say, hey, I looked at the frequently asked questions, it didn't quite address what I needed, but at least they kind of know where you are and what information you've seen. There are also other EPA resources available on our Mark Grant resources page, also linked at the bottom. There's tons and tons of information out there. There are tons of webinars, but always you can reach out to your tab if you have questions. They're a fantastic resource that's free and available to you, and they can provide you so much guidance moving forward as you work on your applications. Okay, next slide, please. And I get all the question slides. So if anyone has any questions, again, you can type them into the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and talk with us, or you can also wait until the end of the meeting and we'll stick around a little bit if you have any other questions. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to hand this off. Oh, also there's a poll that should have popped up on your screen. If you can please fill that out for Tab, that helps with how we design our webinars and how things are going and what you all think and what you're interested in seeing in the future. So make sure that you fill out that poll for the Tab. And now I'm going to pass it over to them.
Great. So now we're going to go over some of the resources available through Mid-Atlantic TAB. Mid-Atlantic TAB offers brownfield education. That includes training, webinars, and events like this. Resource identification. We can help with grant writing assistance. We can't help write your grants for EPA Brownfield grants. So that's a conflict of interest, but we help with reviewing those grants, providing any feedback, and also helping to come up with resource roadmaps. We can also help local brownfield program support if we need to develop a brownfield inventory. If we have any questions on the site or any other technical support needed on a local level. We can also help with project development and design assistance. This is site-specific design assistance and design support. We have a lot of different partners throughout our TAB group that can help with design assistance. All right, so important deadlines. January 16th is our deadline for you to submit your draft applications to be able to get them reviewed in time. January 14th is the deadline to submit for that request letter from the PA DEP. And then January 28th is the final deadline for EPA grant submittal. And again, the PA contacts are John Gross, Christian Smith for EPA. And here is all of our contact information.